the kickoff for Black Student Union for the month of February. So first I want to introduce our speaker. So the speaker will be Dr. Devethia Guillory, who will be presenting on the history of soul food, experience the African American journey through soul food. She served as the Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Lone Star College-North Harris. She earned bachelor's and master's degrees in history at the University of Houston and is currently finishing an educational doctorate in community college leadership at First State University. Her focus as a historian is colonial American history and the rise of slavery in the Atlantic world. So if you please help me in giving her a warm welcome.
Alrighty. So thank you all for being here today. You know, as a dean, I don't get to teach very often, and most of the time when I do teach, I'm teaching in an online class, so it is really awesome to be in a classroom or on a setting at the college and with real live students. I am overjoyed, and I'm really glad for the invitation to be here and this opportunity to share a little bit of my scholarship and some of the things that I enjoy studying and reading about in terms of African American history. Now, when I teach, when I lecture, my lectures are always interactive, so you can ask a question at any time, you can stop me at any time, and we can have a little bit of a dialogue going on while we're going through the presentation. So first thing I'm going to ask you is a question, all right? How many of you know what diaspora is? Have you heard that term before? Okay, since you're sitting close to me, you get to answer right there with the hoodie. Yeah, it has to do with population of people. I need a little bit more information. What is the population of people doing in diaspora? Okay, you need a hint? You want to?
Spread of thoughts and ideas from different cultures.
Okay, that can work with that. So it has to do with the spreading and movement. So whenever you see the term diaspora, it has to do with the dispersal of people. But when you have people moving around, you're going to have movement not just physically of the people themselves, but also their culture, their ideas, their belief systems, how they do things, okay? So when we look at the history, some of the background of soul food, it's really, really closely tied to the movement of people of African descent. You really wouldn't have soul food today in America if we didn't have that movement of people in the past. So we're going to start with just a little bit of an introduction. Always want to give you an overview so you know where we're going. And if I get off track, you can put me back on track, all right? So we'll start with a little bit of an introduction, just a little overview of the start of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, because that really is the catalyst for this movement of people of African descent, this massive movement of people of African descent that ultimately plays a role in the development of soul food as we know it today. And we're going to make a little stop and a little detour with rice cultivation. Rice is a food, and it has a very important role in kind of helping us understand how this diaspora works and how that when people of African descent, enslaved peoples were moved from Africa to the New World and around the New World, that they brought some very important contributions. And I know oftentimes when we think about slavery or we think about enslavement, we view it as a system of victimization, which it was. We view it as a system of oppression and repression, which it was those things. But at the same time, there are some positives that can be associated not with the system itself, but with the way that the peoples who were enslaved in the system, how they reacted to their experiences. And so we'll look at a little bit of that, and rice cultivation has to do with that. And then we're gonna finish up with a little closer view. So we're gonna hone in on this idea of soul food, how it's related to the diaspora, the movement of people, and really look at the evolution of soul food. So soul food didn't start out as soul food from the very beginning, and we'll look at that journey. Now, just to give you a little bit of an understanding of how slavery worked and how the slave trade worked and how this diaspora of people of African descent began, it actually began a very, very long time ago in the 1400s. The first people to be involved in what we would term as an Atlantic slave trade were actually the Portuguese. They were the first to really begin this exploration that exploded into discovery and exploration in the Western Hemisphere. And while they were experimenting with exploring, they did some journeys along the west coast of Africa and began to engage with Africans along the west coast of Africa. And they became involved in a slave trade with Africans, trading goods that were made in Europe for goods that were made in Africa. At first, you don't go in and just say, hey, I want to buy all your slaves. Okay, they didn't start out that way. They took some African-made goods, but ultimately what they really need, because of the type of agricultural production they became involved in some, you can't really see them on this map, but there's some tiny little islands off the west coast of Africa, the Canary Islands and the Madeira Islands, and the Portuguese introduced sugar production in that area. And so the native peoples who live, or the indigenous peoples who lived on those islands, the work that's involved with sugar production is so arduous, it's so hard, it's so difficult. Basically, they died off. And so for this lucrative sugar production to continue, the Portuguese needed workers. And so they saw that there was a very active slave trade in Africa among the Africans, and so they began to engage in that. And ultimately what happens is, instead of them being willing to exchange or use a medium of exchange that involved African goods and mostly agricultural products, they demanded that in order for Africans to be able to purchase the steel and the weapons that they were producing or had access to, that they would only take slaves. And so the first slaves are going to be introduced on those islands right off the west coast of Africa. Ultimately, as more and more Europeans pour into the Western Hemisphere, and sugar production particularly expands. That's the first major cash crop that expands during this time period, bringing in an abundance of wealth. So think of sugar as producing the same amount of wealth as oil today. Okay, something that was very, very important, because if you know anything about food back in the day in Europe, it was real nasty. You needed some sugar, trust me. All right, and so. And also they made rum and other products from it. Now, if you look at that map of people, and all the red is people coming out of Africa, what's the first thing you notice? Anything? They're going everywhere. They're going everywhere. Now, when we think of enslavement and we think of the slave trade, we primarily focus on the Atlantic slave trade. And as you can see, the larger the arrows are, that's an indicator of a larger number of individuals that are being extracted out of Africa and involved in enslavement. But there was a slave trade that was in other parts as well, going to the east. So there's a historian by the name of Patrick Manning, and he estimates that probably somewhere around 10 million slaves were from the same period during the Atlantic slave trade, roughly from 1440 all the way to the early 1800s. Probably about 10 million slaves were going out to the west. Now, if you read in most history books, his numbers are a little bit elevated. He used some different metrics to determine that. And he believed that whereas most historians agree that maybe 12 million slaves went out to the west, he believes the number was a lot higher, because a lot of the slaves died on the ships, some of the slaves jumped overboard, and oftentimes these slaveholders weren't reporting accurate numbers. Okay, so we have a slave trade. Millions of people leaving off the African continent. Now, if you look at North America, what do you notice about the arrow going to North America? Is it big? Is it small? Is it medium size? Don't be scared. It's small. Now, when we think of slavery because of the impact that enslavement has had on this country's history and its development and its economy, we think of it as being a big thing, and it was a big thing. But when you compare the number of slaves that were going into other parts of the Western Hemisphere, primarily because of sugar production, it was relatively small, somewhere between 4 to 5% of those Africans that were brought out of Africa via the Atlantic slave trade were the ones that were going to North America. In fact, we got the leftovers, okay? We got the ones, usually women, children, sometimes if an old person was there, an older person who didn't have as long of a lifespan left to work, maybe wasn't as strong, but the strong, vigorous, virile men primarily went to the Caribbean area and in parts of South America for sugar production because of the amount of labor. It was tremendous labor. It was hard labor. It was arduous labor. So that kind of sets the stage for us understanding the experience of enslavement via the slave trade. But also, I want to bring that out because when you think about what happens with that tiny percent of Africans compared to where Africans ended up via the slave trade in other places other than in what becomes the United States or in North America, it becomes, at least to me, becomes very impactful when you think about African American culture and the impact that it has had on this country and really around the world. That we started out with just a handful of people. They multiplied tremendously, but their impact has multiplied and rebounded tremendously, even today, has a huge impact around the world. Any questions? All right, so this is just a picture of what the experience of enslavement was like for those Africans that were brought to the New World. Now, a lot of times when we think about, this is probably a more realistic image of what it looked like and how they were packed in. Now, if you notice that these slave ships weren't just carrying Africans, they were carrying a lot of goods. They were trying to pack in and make as much money as they could. So oftentimes they were carrying rum, they were carrying other goods, some foodstuffs as well, some of it to feed the slaves. And hence we start our journey talking about food and its relation to enslaved peoples. Now, on the slave ships, when these slaves were being brought, they basically were given the leftovers, whatever was left over. It would be mixed up, and they would be brought to the deck of the ship, and they would be quickly fed, sort of out of these troughs, okay? So the first foods that Africans would consume on their journey across the Middle Passage was nothing like what they ate back home. And I think in a lot of ways, when you think about that, that what they consumed really emphasized that they were being estranged from everything that was near, dear, and important to them, and that they were on a journey. Part of that journey was a food journey, far away from their familiar lives. Now, another thing that people get confused about, and especially as the Atlantic slave trade gained momentum, especially once we get cash crops like tobacco, in addition to the sugar, we're going to get rice. Eventually, we'll get cotton production by the end of the 18th century and the start of the 19th century. One of the things that oftentimes we think is that, that all the slaves came from West Africa. What happens in Africa as the slave trade gains momentum and the demand for slaves increases, what we see is that Africans wanting to trade with Europeans, starting with the Portuguese and the Dutch will take over the slave trade, and ultimately the English will dominate the slave trade. What we find is that in order to engage in that trade, in that commerce, it drove these African nations to try to find more slaves. So initially, maybe a lot of the slaves came from West Africa, but as the slave trade proceeded, these Africans were moving further and further into the interior of Africa, engaging in wars so that they could capture the defeated and enslave them and engage them in the slave trade. So why do I say that? When we look at the slaves that are engaged in the Africans engaged in the Atlantic slave trade, we're looking at a very, very diverse population for the most part. Not everybody was coming from the same area. Not everybody had the same language. Not everybody came from the same sort of ethnic groups in Africa. They were very, very different. So when you think about terms like soul food or Southern comfort food that's crafted, know that within it, in and of itself, is a lot of diversity of experience. That these peoples found a way to come together and create something cultural that is not something that was uniform, but it was very, very diverse in itself. So it's almost like you have diverseness of diversity happening. Now let's talk about rice cultivation. How many of you like rice? Oh, you good African Americans, there you go. All right, so when we look at rice cultivation, and I like to stop with rice cultivation because rice is a food, and the irony of rice cultivation is rice, if you ever buy a bag of rice, you know rice is a really small grain, but what happens when you cook it? It expands. So rice actually became a very, very important staple that supported the slave trade. Because if you're carrying more and more slaves, and you're carrying all those other goods that we saw in that slave ship, you don't want to have to waste a lot of room carrying food to feed your slaves. And so oftentimes they would also load up on rice because you could start out with a little bit of rice, it would multiply and expand, and you could feed a lot of people with it. So if you think about rice is especially in the South, it's a staple that's probably more of a staple than bread is for other areas and other cultures. And rice became, again, one of the important elements that made the slave trade thrive and made the slave trade important. Now, another question for you. When you think of rice, where do you think rice came from? I heard somebody say, Asia. You're almost right, all right? So remember, one of the reasons that history is so important and one of the reasons that I've studied African American history and why we should study every group's history is that there's a lot of power in the hands of the people who are writing the history. They make some important decisions about what's important, what's not important, who's inferior, and who's superior. And so when historians, the early historians wrote about rice production and cultivation, they accredit the initial domestication of rice with Asia. And what they failed to recognize was that Africa, almost simultaneously, Africans were also domesticating rice and producing rice. And you say, how do you know that? Because I know stuff I read. All right. One of the reasons that we know this is, remember when Europeans were coming to the New World, especially the English, they were looking for wealth. The Spanish discovered a lot of gold and silver in South America, in Mexico, in Central America, what today is Central America or Mesoamerica. The English weren't that lucky. They didn't find any gold and silver laying around. And so for them, the way that they accumulated wealth during colonization was by way of agricultural production or cash crop production. Now, in Virginia and North Carolina, in those colonies, they primarily cultivated what crop? Tobacco, okay? But in South Carolina is really very, very unique when you look at slavery, enslavement, and you look at the colonies. Primarily because most of the people who came to South Carolina, that wasn't their first stop in the Western Hemisphere. They actually originally went to Barbados to produce sugar because remember, sugar was like oil is today. You can make a lot of money. But so many people had come earlier on between early 1600s and the 1640s. Barbados is an island. There's only so much land. And so some of the people who originally went to Barbados thinking that they would get wealthy producing sugar end up going to South Carolina because there was plenty of land. When they get to South Carolina, they didn't come alone. They brought slaves. Now, in other parts of the what becomes the 13 colonies or the British colonies, slavery, they kind of experimented with slavery. They had indentured servants. And when the number of indentured servants started to recede, then they started to gradually replace those indentured servants with slaves and ultimately would completely rely on slavery. In South Carolina, it was different. Those individuals that migrated first from England, then to Barbados, then to South Carolina, they brought a slave system with them and they brought slaves with them. So they made up their mind from the first day they arrived that whatever we produce, it's going to be through slave labor. When they did that, they knew sugar wasn't going to work in South Carolina, so they introduced rice. And from roughly about the 1670s until the 1920s, they accumulated a massive amount of wealth in South Carolina, seeps over into Georgia because of rice production. And they used a lot of slaves. One of the reasons that they used slaves is if you look at that map of Africa, those regions that are colored on the West Coast, the Songhai Empire, Mali, and those areas, what today would be part of Gambia in West Africa, those areas were areas where rice was produced. Africans were producing rice, they had domesticated. They were good at it. Guess what? Those Europeans that came from Barbados and went to South Carolina, they sucked at growing rice. And so what they do that's very interesting is they realize that as they're purchasing certain slaves that come from certain areas, those slaves know how to grow rice. And they're successful where the slaveholders weren't successful. And so they are very meticulous about who they want to be imported as enslaved peoples. And so when they deal with slave traders, they say, I want people from this area and I want people from that area because I know that they know how to grow rice. And this is why when you go to South Carolina and you go just off the coast and you see the Gullah people, this makes South Carolina unique in two ways because you have more. Remember I told you that for the most part, the enslaved peoples were very diverse. You get a little bit of the opposite of that in South Carolina. A lot of these people were coming from relatively the same places. And so because of that, they were able to retain a lot of their African culture. And you see that today with have you ever heard of the Gullah? The Gullah people speaking their Gullah language even today. Got to read about it. It's real good. Don't have time. All right. So one other thing that makes South Carolina unique is because, okay, I'm running out of time. I got to go fast. One other thing that makes South Carolina unique is because of their early adoption of enslavement, because of their dependence on slave labor for rice production, is that in South Carolina, they're going to have something that really no other area in the South will have by the time we get to the 18th century. They will have what we call a majority slave population, okay? By the time we get to a couple of decades before the Revolutionary War, 90% of the people living in South Carolina are African Americans, okay? And so this means that when you look at enslavement in the South, we can get a real sense of how much of the African culture these Africans were able to retain, modify a bit in this new environment, this new social, cultural, and even physical environment, and transplant into the new world, and not really directly transplant, but really build an African American culture, and a lot of that centered around food, okay? So these peoples, they were, so many of them, it was very costly to feed them. And so what the slave holders would do is they basically gave them the dregs. You know, the part of the pig you don't want to eat, like the feet and the ears. How many of you like want a pig ear sandwich? Not many of you, right? So when they gave the rations to the slaves, what the slaves would do is they would take those unsightly, unwanted parts and modify them. And they also, because their climate back home in Africa was similar to the climate in the American South, they were able to find some indigenous plants that were similar to what they had in Africa, and they began to cook those foods, and that slave food becomes the basis for our soul food of today. And so what do you notice about this picture before I move on? What's interesting? Who's growing the rice? Women. So we get a lot more demand for women in South Carolina because the women were the ones who primarily knew how to grow rice. And because of that, we also start to see something interesting developing with slavery in North America that we really don't see in the Caribbean and in South America. And that is almost a balance between the number of males to females. And so now you can have slave families. And so the population in the American South grows very rapidly. So we go from having only about 4 to 5% of the Africans that were brought out of Africa and introduced in the slave trade being brought to America. But by the time that we reach the Civil War era in the 1860s, we have roughly about 4.4 million African Americans. How did that happen? Natural increase. And a lot of that had to do with the type of agricultural production. It had to do with the fact that we were importing more women and men, and they were forming slave families. All right. So when we look at the cuisine of the enslaved, you know, today we love soul food. It's really, really tasty. But it was really the dregs of whatever was left over by that the slaveholder didn't want to eat. So a lot of the things that we think are particularly tasty, like turnip greens, were really the slaveholder took the turnips and we got the turnip tops, which are the greens. And then it would be flavored with fatback and with the various seasonings that the African Americans you had access to. Now, one of the things that's interesting is when, as you see on the picture that's going to be on your right, when some of the African American enslaved women were introduced as house slaves and became cooks, then we saw that slave food took a whole nother turn because of the fact that they had access to even more spices and access to some of the leftover foods from the master's table, and that would be infused in what was slave cuisine. Ultimately, that will be evolved into soul food. Couple of things happen that has to do with this diaspora. So we have people, enslaved people in the South, and what happens, we start to see a movement after Eli Whitney discovered the cotton gin in 1790, and that is cotton production. So those other cash crops are going to gradually be replaced by cotton production, because then cotton becomes sort of the oil of the 19th century because of that. And because of the fact that tobacco production and some of the other types of agricultural production that had taken place in the South was so destructive to the soil, then slaveholders started to move further and further across the Southwest into new areas to produce cotton because it was such a lucrative product. As a consequence, as these enslaved peoples are moving, what are they taking with them? They're taking with them their culture, they're taking with them their modes of producing, of cooking, and this is where we see this movement of African American slave cuisine, and it's on its way and making its evolution to becoming soul food. After emancipation, some of the skills that Africans had learned during enslavement in the form of foraging, adding to their diet. Yes, they received rations as slaves, but as they move further, beyond enslavement, there were no masters anymore and mistresses that provided them with food rations. Now they had to do a lot of their foraging, and so they're going to expand the amounts of foods that they include in their diets. And they're very good at foraging because they've done this all along. And so as we see in emancipation, in the midst of all of the scarcity that was around, African Americans would thrive because of the type of food that they were intaking, these high caloric, high carb, high fat, but also high protein foods that enabled them to do the hard work that they did, no longer as slaves, but oftentimes as sharecroppers. Again, slave food, now emancipation food, Southern comfort food is moving even further west. Some of the African Americans, especially those that had fought in the Civil War, looking for opportunity in the West, would go west. And so when you think about the good old Western movies, one person that's missing from the Western movies that's a part of our movie genre is the African American. Oftentimes, the African Americans were the cowboys in the West. In fact, it was African Americans who had fought in the Civil War that were known as Buffalo Soldiers, played a huge role in the West in the defeat of Native Americans. And again, once the Native Americans had pretty much been defeated by the end of the 19th century, then they also took on a new job. Our first forest rangers in the West were actually some of these former Buffalo Soldiers. So as we move and expand across the North American continent in the United States, African Americans are moving further west. They're taking their culture, and they're also taking their food, and they're adapting that food to the environments that they're in. And that's why oftentimes you'll see that in certain areas, soul food there's a different content to that soul food. Again, further migration, this time into further west, but also into some of the urban areas, into places like New York. A lot of African Americans would settle in what today is Harlem, in Chicago, Philadelphia, and these other urban areas. And they took their food, their Southern comfort food, with them. Now, we really, even though I've been calling it soul food, it really was Southern comfort food, leaving their homes in the South, because primarily most African Americans lived in the South through the end of the Civil War. It's really not until Jim Crow policy creating an apartheid society in the South and the repression of Jim Crow that a lot of African Americans start to leave the South. In fact, there's a massive exodus between 1910 and 1930. And when they left the South, they wanted to bring a bit of their culture with them, and they brought their Southern comfort food along with them. And so now Southern comfort food, or the food of formerly enslaved peoples that was limited to the South, is now expanding into new urban areas in the North. Now, really, the term soul food is something that came about as a consequence of the civil rights movement. As African Americans, really, we go through something similar to what we saw with the Harlem Renaissance, where there's this sense of racial pride, this sense of valuing our history, especially that part of their history that's connected to that African past. And so no longer are we just calling the foods that were eaten in the South, brought to all these different areas in the West, in the North, in these urban areas, Southern comfort food. Now we're calling it soul food. And it's not just a food that's particularly tasty, a food that has all this special seasoning, but it's a food that really represents the Black experience. And that's why soul food is so important, because it is representative of a people who have been repressed, a people who have been marginalized, and yet were able to not only retain a portion of their culture, but transplant that culture in America and express that culture in many ways, through music, through art, but most definitely through its food. And so soul food is really taking on that sense of not just, it's something that we survive with, but it's something that has caused us as a people to thrive, to be able to overcome the many challenges that we felt, that we've experienced, and also to celebrate who we are as a people. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.